Good evening, class. We're going to start talking about chapter 9, but before we jump into chapter 9, I want to go back and to talk about a few of the things that we discussed here in chapter 8, because the way they've structured both their microeconomics book and the macro text, um, chapters tend to, at least to some extent, bend on the other. So again, going to talk for a few minutes about what we did learn in chapter 8. And in chapter 8, we're talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And always remember that when we're looking at aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we're looking at price levels and we're looking at real GDP. And also remember that real GDP, it's basically the nominal GDP divided by the implicit price deflator. And you can play around with them and do some math magic. But again, when we're talking about formulas, especially economic formulas, if it's a 3-variable formula and you know two of the values of the variables, you can always play a little math magic and solve for that third one. So that's just always keep that in mind. And again, don't make the mathematical aspect of economics any more difficult than it is. Yeah, it can get difficult from the mathematical side, but if you just stop and take a step back, you'll realize that the mathematical part of economics, especially the introductory level classes of economics, is not as difficult as most people make it out to be. We also talked about aggregate demand and why it slopes downward. It slopes downward because of the wealth effect. It slopes downward because of the interest rate effect. And it slopes downward because of international trade effects. So those three macroeconomic kind of parameters, the effects, help or tend to drive the slope of that aggregate demand curve downward. And a lot of individuals, both within the government and outside of the government, are always trying to push that aggregate demand curve out. They're trying to keep it moving forward and move it outward to the right. Again, downward sloping, move it out to the right. Same thing with aggregate supply. They want both those curves moving toward to the right because that's generally considered, expansionary efforts and expansionary aspects of the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve. And it implies that as an economy, we're continuing to grow. And as far as changes in aggregate demand, you've got changes in consumption, you've got changes in interest rate, you've got changes in government purchases, and we'll get into the government impact, both monetary and fiscal impacts, a little later on in the text. But don't ever downplay the role of government purchases and making changes in that aggregate demand. Also, it changes in net exports, and again, the multiplier. There's a multiplier effect because as other aspects impact aggregate demand, some of those are going to be multiplied by greater magnitude than others would be. The multiplier is basically calculated. Here we go back to the formulas. It's basically calculated as real GDP demanded at each price level divided by the initial change in aggregate demand. So that's how you actually calculate the multiplier. And if you know real GDP, if you know the change in real GDP, the change in aggregate demand, you can figure out the multiplier. Or if you know the initial change in aggregate demand and you know what the multiplier is, you can calculate the change in real GDP. So again, play a little math magic, play around with the numbers, and if it's a 3-variable function and two of those values, you can always calculate the third one. We also talked for a few minutes about aggregate demand, aggregate supply. There's the short run effects, there's the long run effects, there's impacts in the short run, and they kind of work their way through the system to get the equilibrium price, not only equilibrium in the short run, but more importantly, equilibrium in the long run. We talked about wage stickiness and price stickiness, and those I guess, functions, especially environmental aspects that that impact the stickiness in both wages and prices. And then we spent a fair amount of time talking about demand shocks, and demand shocks usually result in an inflationary gap. And then you've got on the other side, you've got supply shocks, and those usually result in a recessionary gap. And then the gaps, if you were to take it, let's say when you graduate from Fisk and you go into the market sector to work, you go into work as an economist, you may land a job with one of the government agencies that are concerned about managing inflationary gaps and recessionary gaps. And if you do, you're going to be involved in some of these governmental meetings, and you may be asked to go before a congressional meeting and speak to them about what your ideas are on how to impact the recessionary gap and the inflationary gap. And there's kind of a couple of things you can go self-correction or expansion. So that's one thing. So if you're looking at inflationary gap, you're looking at self-correction or expansion. If you're looking at maybe a recessionary gap, you're talking about non-intervention or contraction, or you're flipping it back and forth. So what you're going to have to do is, if you go to work for one of those government agencies, be willing to put forth a lot of effort to understand the concepts or understand the drivers of these inflationary gaps or recessionary gaps, and be able to talk to Senate, House Representative subcommittees. I worked my first 3 years, 2.5, 3 years out of graduate school. I went to work for Economic Research Service. And that's the analytical arm of the Department of Agriculture. And it was not out of the ordinary. I had to go before Senate committees on multiple occasions, and it can be uncomfortable, but as long as you understand the economic underpinnings, it's pretty easy to get through some of these Senate, subcommittee meetings. Some of the lawmakers, they not be hardly as versed in economic fundamentals as you're going to be, and so you stand a pretty good chance of being able to work your way through it. Now let's move on to the new material in Chapter 9. Chapter 9 deals with economic growth, and why they're concerned with economic growth, why not only government is, but those of us that are living and working and functioning in the market economy, we should always be concerned about economic growth, because it makes us wealthier, makes us healthier, makes us happier. We should all be concerned about it. We should all be able to understand the economic underpinnings or economic fundamentals that are going to drive that economic growth. And how do you define economic growth? A couple of pieces of tidbits that came out of the text in Chapter 9. Short-term changes in real GDP versus long-term increase in the economic's production possibilities. And that's what drives the economy's potential output. So you've got these, and they do a pretty good job in the text. And I think I've got scribbled down here, page 299 in the text, but they have some graphs in the text, and they do a pretty good job of kind of walking you through how the economic growth has progressed over. I think one of the graphs, they actually progresses over the last couple of 100 years. They're talking about an outward shift in the production possibilities curve, and it shifts the long run aggregate supply curve to the right. Remember, we were talking about as we went through the review on Chapter 8. You want that aggregate demand curve moving to the right, but you also want that long run average supply curve moving to the right. That's going to expand the real GDP, and that's going to be the measure of the true growth of the economy. And media is consumed in the fluctuations in the short run aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And it's actually not only the media that's concerned with it, but policymakers are too, because when you're talking about these small changes and multiple small changes in that short run aggregate demand, aggregate supply, over time they can add up and significantly impact the long run changes in aggregate demand, aggregate supply. The real GDP fluctuations around the potential output. And again, on page 299, I think those of you that have bought the text, go back and take a look at those graphs on page 299, because that portrays the United States from going from a very poor economy to an extremely wealthy economy, and not only poor to extremely wealthy, but it has turned the United States into the world, maybe the world's leading economy. China may argue with you, but that's at least that's where we have been in the past, and that's where we would like to continue to be. And again, when you're trying to push that outward shift of that production possibility curve, because as you're pushing that production possibilities curve outward, you're shifting the long run aggregate supply to the right, and that's going to help boost that real GDP going forward. Then they spend a few minutes talking about the rule of 72. I can remember talking about it when I was in graduate school, and it's not a bad, it's an estimate. So it's actually a pretty good estimate, and they go through kind of the mechanics of it in the text, and they talk about the rule of 72 and differences in growth rates. And so exponential growth, when a quantity grows at a given percentage rate, multiplying each year's growth by a constant percentage. So it's almost, think about compounding interest. You're multiplying and you're multiplying. So interest adds to the principal, compound it again, and time over time, it helps. Over the years, it helps expand that out. And the rule of 72, it actually estimates a variable's approximate doubling time equals to 72 divided by the growth rate stated as a whole number. So for the years to grow or to double, you take 72 and divide it by the growth rate. Then that will get you a multiple of years that it's going to take the economy to double. And the authors, and especially in the text, they talk about the Oval Office economist. They worry, and policymakers worry about small changes in economic growth. And if you listen to, I usually listen to, Fox Business News in the morning. You could, there's CNN, there's, the Wall Street Journal has one, Barron's Roundtable on the weekends. And all of these are really concerned with, they're concerned about the short run, concerned about the short run's impact on the long run, but a lot of the discussion is driven by short run changes. And over time, small differences in growth rates create large differences in output and the standard of living. So that's one reason that especially investors are concerned with these short run changes, because over time, the differences in output can definitely impact the standard of living. And they go through some calculations in the text, and they're talking about one way to actually measure growth is to measure the growth in output per capita. When they're talking about per capita, they're talking about per head count or per individual in a population. They also, can express it in real GDP per person, and that's truly the output per capita. And then the formula that they give you in the text is output per capita is equal to the real GDP divided by N, and they have N is equal to the population. So basically taking the real GDP and dividing by the population, and that's going to get you the output per capita. And the output per capita is a fairly effective estimate when you're comparing, maybe you're comparing countries. So you're comparing the United States to China, the United States to Germany. Maybe you're in there trying to figure out on underdeveloped countries. Maybe you're trying to compare 200 developed countries, and one country might look like the real GDP is significantly greater than the other country, but when you take and you adjust it by the population, that gives you a fairly decent estimate and a comparable metric that you can compare not only between two countries, but you can compare across multiple countries. Compare developed versus underdeveloped, and it does a really good job, and they do a pretty good job in the text explaining to you how you do the calculations and what it actually means. Also, remember that when you go back to one of the previous chapters, when you talk about real GDP, you're talking about the market value of production valued at a base year. I think maybe now we're using 2015 as the base year. I can't remember what the actual number on the base year is, but they take and let's say, so we're in 2023. They're going to take the real production 2023, value it at, say, 2015 base rate, which is different than the nominal GDP, which is the market value of today's production valued at current prices. So again, it's that implicit price deflator that allows us to toggle back and forth between real GDP and nominal GDP. Then again, the implicit price deflator, if you play a little math magic in there, it's nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. And in implicit price deflator, you'll hear some economists talking about it's a price index of all final goods and services. So it's just a way that economists are going to try to tie and provide comparable metrics when we're talking about not only within a country, but when you're especially talking about comparing either between a couple of countries or comparing among a multitude of countries. Output per capita is a direct gauge of an economy's standard of living, which makes sense. The higher the output per capita, in theory, it's the greater your standard of living. And some people, some individuals that, when they're talking heads on TV or just students playing in, the economic theory of a certain level of classes that they're taking, they like to make things a little more as simplified or as simplistic as possible because it helps us understand what's going on. And they play a little math magic in the text, and they provide you with a formula that says the percentage change in output per capita is equal to the percentage change in real GDP minus the percentage change in population. So if you believe that the percentage change output per capita is the same thing as the percentage change in standard of living, then we must grow the percentage change in real GDP at a greater rate than the percentage change in the population, or our standard of living is going to fall. And so it's the standard of living, it's the impact on society. Are we maximizing society's net benefits? Are we providing a standard of living across the entire society of a country? And that is the goal of the growth. It is you want to continue to improve the standard of living not only within your country, but other countries within a global impact. And then the text goes into growth in the long run average supply curve. As again, you're talking about an acronym of LRAS, and you'll see that not only in this economics text, but you see it on TV. You heard the talking heads discussing it. In economic growth, it's the economy's potential output is increasing. So the long run average supply, you want the potential output is vertical. So you've got a long run average supply curve, and they do a really good job in the text walking us through this. So you've got the aggregate supply and aggregate demand downward sloping, long run average supply, it's vertical. You've got the price level over here on your vertical axis. On your horizontal axis, you've got the real GDP and economic growth. We talked about it a few minutes ago. Economic growth shifts the long run average supply curve to the right. So you're bumping that long run average supply curve to the right. And as you bump it to the right, remember it's vertical. As you bump it to the right, you're going to increase the real GDP. And on the horizontal graph, Y is the potential output. So you're bumping that real GDP over to the right, and it's going to increase that as the long run average supply curve is bumped to the right. How do economists know where potential output is? They're going to look at the aggregate production function. And where does long run average supply come from? Long run aggregate supply come from? And what factors cause it to shift? And that information we can glean from understanding the aggregate production function. The aggregate production function is defined in your text as the potential output. It's the position of the long run average supply curve. So there's your potential output. Long run aggregate supply curve is your potential output. And again, economy's ability to produce goods and services. So that's what the aggregate production function is talking about. An economy's ability to produce goods and services, and its potential output of that economy, and it's portrayed as a position of the long run aggregate supply curve. And again, in the text, they've got it positioned as vertical. Go back to your old micro classes, and we probably talked, and I think it was discussed probably in chapters 1 through 4 of this text, because what does a firm's production function tell you? The firm's production function tells you how a firm takes inputs, runs it through their black box using technology and entrepreneurship, and produces output on the other side of that black box. So it makes sense that the aggregate production function is just a summation of all of the across all of the firm's production functions. So what we're doing is on the production function, you're taking inputs, running it through a production process, and outputs come out the other side of the black box. The aggregate production function, it's defined in the text again as the function that relates the total output of an economy to the total amount of labor employed in the economy, all other determinants of production. And remember, determinants of production, or if go back to your first 4 chapters in this text, talk about factors of production. You've got labor, capital, natural resources, and typically natural resources, people are concerned about land because it is a natural resource. You've got technology, and again, remember, technology is not semiconductor, computer chips as much as it is. It's the production function. It's the efficient way that a firm can take those big 3 factors of production and and use those to transform input into output. And then you've also got entrepreneurship sitting over here with technology, helping to improve the efficiency of a firm's production function. And again, remember, we've talked about, multiple times, ceteris paribus, all other things being unchanged. So when you're talking about aggregate production functions, especially from an economic perspective, and it starts out in the short run when you're, go back to your old micro classes, and you're talking about in the short run. In the short run, you've got a variable that you've got a factor of production that is quoted a variable, and you have all the others fixed. In the long run, all of the factors of production are variable, but in the short run, there's only one of them that can vary, and all the rest of them have to stay fixed. And for the most part, when it comes to playing around with which factors of production are fixed and which are variable in the short run, most economists select labor because it is the factor of production that is the easiest to vary, especially in the short run. An economy operating on its aggregate production function is producing its potential level of output. So remember that an economy operating on its aggregate production function is producing its potential level of output. And then I'm going to leave you with one other definition before we kind of wrap this segment up and take a quick break. I want to talk just a few minutes about diminishing marginal returns. It's a situation that occurs when initial units of a variable factor, again, variable factor, adds less and less to total output, given constant quantities of the other factors. So just think about that. When they're talking about, and especially in the short run, you're varying labor, keep everything else is fixed, everything else is constant. I like to use Starbucks as an example because, especially with college students, I've yet to run into a college student that didn't know about Starbucks. But if you're talking about Starbucks, when you're talking about varying labor, think about when you go into your local Starbucks. So I'm not a coffee drinker, but I've been in there enough, I guess, to kind of understand the process. But you walk in, somebody hollering, "Yay, welcome to Starbucks." You go into Starbucks and you usually have an individual that's working the cash register, takes your order. That order's placed. Typically, at least most of the Starbucks I've been to, you've got one person over here. If you order like a sandwich, it has to be microwaved, or a muffin, or something to eat. You've got one, maybe two people over here working the food side. Over here on the other side, kind of where they're doing the tea and the coffee and all the woo-woo drinks that you can get at Starbucks, you've got one, maybe two people over here working those. So, most Starbucks that I've been into have maybe 4 or 5 people working, and they are doing that because they have figured out that the diminishing marginal returns. So let's say they've got 4, and this Starbucks only has 4. They figured out that 5th person doesn't marginally bring enough additional output to offset hiring. And so when you're a Starbucks or any other firm, you're looking at you're basically looking at the marginal revenue product of labor, and you set that equal to the marginal factor cost of that labor. And that's how you determine what your staffing function is. Again, most of you have heard this ad nauseum when you were taking microeconomics. So that's the way they're doing that staffing level. And again, always remember that when you're talking about economics, or you're talking about economists, or you're talking about consumer decisions, you're talking about decisions of the firm. Decisions of the firm are going to continue to increase and continue to produce as long as marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. And once marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, they know to stop, because at that point they have maximized the net benefit to society. You've got consumers. You're a consumer. I'm a consumer. Person sitting next to you in your classroom's your consumer, and your neighbor's a consumer. Person next door to you in the dorm, you're going to continue to consume goods and services as long as your marginal benefit is greater than your marginal cost. You're trying to maximize marginal utility. And it all goes back to the 3 pillars of economic thought: opportunity cost, making decisions at the margin, self-interest. You're optimizing something. That's your self-interest. And that's what drives decisions of not only individual firms, but the decisions of an economy in general. And so, you can think about McDonald's, you can think about Starbucks. Next time you go in your doctor's office, just look around. And the doctor's office, doctor's offices are, like Starbucks, buildings, brick and mortar. They may have X number of exam rooms, and if they've got 6 exam rooms, really doesn't do any good to have 7 physicians, because, what's that 7th physician going to do if 6 exam rooms are filled and there's nowhere to see patients? So just remember that whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you decide once you get out of Fisk to become an entrepreneur and establish your own business, or you go to work for somebody else, you're always concerned about the diminishing marginal returns to any decision that you make. And also, it goes back to Adam Smith. Think about Adam Smith. He's the Scottish economist that talks about the invisible hand, market forces driving supply and demand to equilibrium. But he also talked about additional labor allows firms to specialize. Bricks and mortar, capital stock, and technology can only handle so many units of labor before it starts hitting this diminishing marginal return. So, an extremely important concept. We'll touch on it as we continue to move forward, but also an extremely important concept that is tied back to those three pillars of economic thought. With that, we're going to stop and kind of take a break, and we'll be back a few minutes to talk about segment number 2. Thank you.